The morning Karen Hendricks knocked on my door, I was elbow-deep in potting soil, transplanting native wildflowers I'd rescued from a construction site across town. My hands were caked with earth, my hair escaped in wild tendrils from my ponytail, and it probably looked like I'd been wrestling with nature itself, which in a way, I had been. "Excuse me," came the sharp rap on my front door, followed by an even sharper voice. "We need to talk about your ... situation." I wiped my hands on my gardening apron, already knowing who stood on my porch before I opened the door. Karen Hendricks, president of the Maple Grove Homeowners Association, was a woman who could make a dandelion feel ashamed of its existence. She stood there in her pristine white capris and matching tennis shoes, clipboard clutched to her chest. Like a shield, her perfectly coiffed blonde hair not daring to move in the gentle morning breeze. "Good morning, Karen," I said, trying to keep my voice pleasant despite the knot forming in my stomach. "What can I do for you?" Her pale blue eyes swept over me with obvious disapproval before she launched into what I would later refer to as the complaint. It was a masterpiece of suburban indignation, delivered with the precision of a lawyer and the passion of someone who had clearly been rehearsing this moment for weeks. "Mrs. Chen," she began, consulting her clipboard with theatrical importance, "I've received numerous complaints about the state of your front yard. As HOA president, it's my duty to address concerns that affect our community's property values and aesthetic standards." I glanced over at my garden, my pride and joy, my sanctuary, my 3-year labor of love. What Karen saw as chaos, I saw as careful orchestration. The native grasses swayed in deliberate wildness, providing seed heads for the goldfinches that visited each morning. The patch of what she probably called weeds was actually a carefully curated collection of native plants, purple coneflowers, black-eyed Susans, and wild bergamot that hummed with the activity of dozens of bee species. "I'm not sure I understand the problem," I said, though I suspected I knew exactly what was coming. Karen's clipboard rattled as she flipped through pages of what appeared to be extensive documentation. "Let me be specific. Your front yard violates multiple HOA covenants. Section 4.2 states that all landscaping must be neat, orderly, and in keeping with the established neighborhood aesthetic. Section 4.7 requires that grass be maintained at no more than 3 inches in height. And Section 4.12 explicitly prohibits wild or untamed plant growth that may harbor pests or create unsightly conditions." She paused for breath, her face flushed with righteous indignation. "Furthermore, Mrs. Chen, I've observed what appears to be deliberate cultivation of dandelions, clover, and other invasive species. The corner of your yard has become completely overgrown with what I can only describe as prairie grass, and there are multiple reports of increased bee activity that's making neighbors uncomfortable." I felt my jaw tighten. "Those aren't invasive species, Karen. They're native plants that I'm not finished," she interrupted, holding up one manicured finger. "The wooden structures you've erected, those birdhouses, and what appears to be some kind of insect hotel, they're not approved architectural features. And don't get me started on that pile of logs and brush you've allowed to accumulate in the back corner." The brush pile, of course. What Karen saw as neglect was actually a carefully constructed habitat for small wildlife, a place where rabbits could shelter, where beneficial insects could overwinter, where the occasional salamander could find cool, damp refuge during hot summer days. "I've also documented," she continued, warming to her subject, "the presence of what I believe to be a family of skunks that have taken up residence somewhere in your yard. Mrs. Patterson from 2 houses down reported seeing them multiple times, and frankly, it's becoming a safety concern." I almost smiled at that. The skunks were some of my favorite garden visitors. A mother and her 2 kits had indeed made themselves at home under the old oak tree, and I'd watched them through my kitchen window on countless evenings as they wandered through the garden, hunting for grubs and insects. They were gentle creatures, far more afraid of humans than we were of them, and they provided invaluable pest control services. Mrs. Chen, Karen's voice, took on what I'm sure she thought was a reasonable tone. "I'm not trying to be difficult. I'm simply asking you to bring your property into compliance with our community standards. A nice, neat lawn, perhaps some foundation, plantings with appropriate shrubs, maybe a few annual flowers in organized beds. Nothing too complicated." I looked past her to the street, where identical houses sat behind identical lawns, each one a testament to suburban conformity. Emerald green grass stretched from sidewalk to foundation, interrupted only by the occasional ornamental tree or carefully shaped shrub. It was tidy, orderly, and completely lifeless. "I understand your concerns, Karen," I said carefully, "but I'd like you to understand something about what I'm trying to do here. This isn't random or careless. Every plant in this garden has been chosen for a specific purpose." I gestured toward the patch of what she'd called weeds. "Those purple coneflowers, they're native to this region, and they provide nectar for butterflies and seeds for birds. The grass you're calling overgrown is little bluestem, which is what covered these prairies before we built houses on them. It prevents erosion, requires no fertilizer or pesticides, and provides habitat for native insects." Karen's expression suggested she was listening to someone speak in a foreign language. "Mrs. Chen, I appreciate your interest in nature, but we have rules for a reason. This is a residential neighborhood, not a nature preserve. But why can't it be both?" I asked the question, spilling out before I could stop myself. Why do we have to choose between living here and letting other species live here too? For a moment, something flickered across Karen's face, surprise, maybe, or confusion. But it was quickly replaced by her usual stern expression. "Because," she said, as if the answer were obvious, "we have property values to maintain. We have standards to uphold. And frankly, Mrs. Chen, your yard is bringing down the entire neighborhood." She flipped to a new page on her clipboard with a flourish. "I'm officially notifying you that you have 30 days to bring your property into compliance with HOA regulations. If you fail to do so, you'll be subject to fines of $50 per day until the violations are corrected. Continued noncompliance could result in legal action." I felt my heart sink. 30 days. 30 days to destroy 3 years of careful cultivation. To rip out plants that had taken seasons to establish, to eliminate the habitats that dozens of species had come to depend on. "I'm sorry it's come to this," Karen said, though her tone suggested she wasn't sorry at all. "But rules are rules, and everyone has to follow them. It's what makes our community special." After she left, I stood in my driveway for a long time, looking at my garden with new eyes. For the first time since I'd begun this project, I tried to see it as Karen saw it. Was it really so terrible? Were the slightly overgrown edges and natural randomness really such an affront to suburban sensibilities? I'd moved to Maple Grove 3 years ago after my divorce, seeking a fresh start in a quiet neighborhood where I could finally have the garden I'd always dreamed of. My ex-husband had preferred the kind of landscaping Karen advocated for, neat, controlled, more about appearances than ecology. But I'd always been drawn to the wild spaces, the places where nature was allowed to be itself. The idea for the native plant garden had come gradually. I'd started with a few wildflowers, enchanted by the butterflies they attracted. Then I'd added some native grasses, fascinated by their deep roots and drought tolerance. The birdhouses had followed, then the bee house, then the brush pile where I'd started composting garden waste and fallen branches. Each addition had brought new visitors. The goldfinches that came for the coneflower seeds, the hummingbirds that discovered the wild bergamot, the tiny native bees that nested in the holes I'd drilled in pieces of scrap wood, the family of rabbits that had made their home in the tall grass, and yes, the skunks, who had arrived one spring evening and simply never left. It had become a living ecosystem, a small patch of what this place might have looked like before houses and lawns and sidewalks. It was messy and wild and completely alive, and I loved every square inch of it. But now it was all in jeopardy. 30 days to conform or face daily fines that would quickly become unaffordable. 30 days to choose between my mortgage and my principles. That evening, as I sat on my back porch with a cup of tea, watching the skunks emerge for their nightly foraging expedition, I made a decision that would change everything. I wouldn't give up without a fight, but I also wouldn't fight the way Karen expected me to. I would fight with science, with documentation, with official recognition of what I'd created. I would show the world and the Maple Grove Homeowners Association that my messy garden was actually something remarkable. I would turn Karen's complaint into the catalyst for something beautiful. That night, I began researching certified wildlife habitat programs, native plant societies, and environmental conservation organizations. I started documenting every species I'd observed in my garden, every plant I'd cultivated, every small miracle of nature that called my little patch. The next morning, I woke up with the determination of someone who'd found their purpose. While Karen probably expected me to be out shopping for sod and hedge trimmers, I was instead armed with my laptop, a fresh cup of coffee, and a legal pad. That would soon become my battle plan. My first discovery came within minutes of opening my browser: the National Wildlife Federation's Certified Wildlife Habitat Program. As I scrolled through the requirements, my heart began to race. Food sources for wildlife. Check. Water sources. Check. Places for wildlife to find shelter. Double check. Places for wildlife to raise their young. Triple check. Sustainable gardening practices. But the most beautiful discovery was yet to come. As I dug deeper into the program's website, I found a section titled Urban Wildlife Habitats that featured case studies of certified habitats in residential neighborhoods. There, in full-color photographs, were gardens that looked remarkably similar to my native plants growing in naturalistic arrangements, birdhouses nestled among wildflowers, brush piles artfully integrated into landscape designs. "These aren't violations," I whispered to my computer screen, feeling a surge of vindication. "These are features." I printed out the certification requirements and began a methodical inventory of my garden. The exercise was both thrilling and eye-opening. I'd always known my garden was special, but seeing it through the lens of official wildlife habitat criteria revealed just how comprehensive my accidental ecosystem had become. Food sources. In addition to the seed-producing native plants, I'd unknowingly created a multi-layered feeding environment. The oak tree provided acorns for squirrels and chipmunks. The native cherry tree I'd planted 2 years ago was already producing fruit for birds. The diverse flowering plants bloomed in succession from early spring through late fall, providing nectar sources throughout the growing season. Even my messy practice of leaving some plant stalks standing through winter provided seeds for overwintering birds. Water sources. This was where I realized I had some work to do. While my garden collected rainwater naturally in small depressions, and I'd installed a simple rain barrel, I needed something more deliberate. By afternoon, I was at the garden center, selecting a shallow ceramic basin that would serve as a ground-level water source and researching designs for a small rain garden in the lowest corner of my yard. Shelter. Karen's pile of logs and brush was actually a sophisticated shelter system, though I'd never thought of it that way. The brush pile provided cover for small mammals and nesting sites for birds. The native grasses offered protection from predators and harsh weather. The oak trees' sprawling branches created natural windbreaks and roosting spots. Nesting sites. Beyond the obvious birdhouses, I'd inadvertently created numerous nesting opportunities. The dense growth of native shrubs provided sites for birds to build their nests. The bee house I'd constructed was already occupied by several species of native bees. Even the skunks had found suitable denning sites in the root system of the old oak. Sustainable practices. This was perhaps my strongest category. I'd been composting for 3 years, never used pesticides or chemical fertilizers, and had removed most of the non-native plants that had come with the house. I collected rainwater, practiced natural pest management, and had even started saving seeds from my native plants to share with other gardeners. As I worked through the certification checklist, I felt a growing sense of excitement. This wasn't just about proving Karen wrong, though. That was certainly a motivating factor. This was about validation, about having an external authority recognize the value of what I'd been doing, but the real revelation came when I called the National Wildlife Federation's certification hotline to ask about the timeline for the review process. "Oh, that's wonderful," said the cheerful voice on the other end of the line. "We love to see residential habitats, especially in suburban settings. They're so important for wildlife corridors. Now, let me check on the timeline for you, ... It looks like the review process typically takes about 2 to 3 weeks from the time we receive your application. 2 to 3 weeks? I had 30 days to comply with Karen's demands, but I could potentially have official recognition of my garden as a certified wildlife habitat in less than that time. "There's one more thing," the representative continued. "Once your habitat is certified, you'll receive an official yard sign that identifies your property as a certified wildlife habitat. Many of our participants find that it helps educate their neighbors about the importance of native plants and wildlife conservation. An official sign. I could practically see Karen's face when she discovered that my ventilation-ridden garden was actually a certified conservation area. But even as I reveled in the prospect of Karen's reaction, I realized something else was happening. This process was changing how I saw my own garden. What had begun as a personal sanctuary was revealing itself to be something much more significant. A model for sustainable suburban living, a demonstration of how residential spaces could support biodiversity. That afternoon, I began the meticulous process of documenting everything. I photographed every plant, every structure, every corner of my garden. I started a species list, noting every bird, insect, and mammal I'd observed. I mapped the garden's layout, identifying the specific functions of each area. The work was meditative and revelatory. I found myself noticing details I'd previously overlooked: the way the native grasses created natural pathways for small animals, the strategic placement of the brush pile near the oak tree's root system, the gradual transition from the more formal plantings near the house to the wilder areas toward the back of the property. As I worked, I began to see the garden as Karen must see it, but also as something else entirely. Yes, it was different from the manicured lawns that surrounded it. Yes, it was less controlled, less predictable. But it was also more alive, more complex, more integrated with the natural systems that had existed here long before our subdivision was built. That evening, as I sat at my kitchen table organizing my documentation, I heard a familiar rustling in the garden. Through the window, I watched as the mother skunk emerged from her den, followed by her 2 kits. They moved through the garden with the confidence of creatures who knew they were safe here, pausing to investigate interesting scents, playfully tumbling over each other in the soft grass. I thought about Karen's complaint about the skunks, about her characterization of them as a safety concern. But watching them now, I saw something different. I saw a family that had found refuge in an increasingly developed landscape. I saw animals that were living their lives peacefully, bothering no one, asking only for a place to exist. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a wildlife biologist from the local university, stood on my porch with a warm smile and a manila folder under her arm. "Mrs. Chen, I hope you don't mind me stopping by unannounced. I'm Elena Rodriguez from the university's Environmental Sciences Department. I understand you're working on wildlife habitat certification." I invited her in, puzzled about how she'd learned about my project over coffee. She explained that she'd been contacted by the National Wildlife Federation about my application. "They sometimes reach out to us when they have applications for urban habitats," she said. "We're conducting a study on residential wildlife corridors, and your garden sounds like it might be exactly what we're looking for." She opened her folder and pulled out several documents. "I've been mapping wildlife habitats in suburban areas, trying to understand how small patches of native vegetation can support biodiversity. Would you be willing to participate in our research?" I felt my heart race. "What would that involve?" "We'd conduct a comprehensive biological survey of your property, documenting all the plant and animal species we can identify. We'd also install a few small monitoring devices to track wildlife activity over time. In exchange, you'd receive a detailed ecological assessment of your garden and ongoing support for habitat improvements." "And this is legitimate scientific research?" I asked, thinking of Karen's reaction. Dr. Rodriguez smiled. "Absolutely. We're particularly interested in how residential habitats can serve as stepping stones for wildlife movement through developed areas. Your garden might be playing a much more important role in the local ecosystem than you realize." That afternoon, Dr. Rodriguez and 2 graduate students spent 4 hours in my garden. Armed with cameras, measuring tools, and species identification guides, I followed them around like an excited child, learning things about my own garden that I'd never known. "This is remarkable," Dr. Rodriguez said as she knelt beside the brush pile. "You've created a perfect microhabitat for salamanders. See these logs? They're at exactly the right stage of decomposition to provide the cool, moist environment salamanders need." She moved to the native grass area that Karen had complained about, and this little bluestomits, supporting at least 6 different species of native insects that I can identify just from what I'm seeing on the plants right now. These insects are food sources for birds, and they're also pollinators for other native plants. The graduate students were equally enthusiastic. They found evidence of 13 different bird species using the garden, including several that were cons. The call came on a Wednesday morning, exactly 8 days after I'd submitted my application. I was in the garden, installing the new water feature I'd designed: a shallow, naturalistic basin surrounded by native sedges that would provide drinking water for birds while creating a small wetland habitat for amphibians. Mrs. Chen, this is Jennifer from the National Wildlife Federation. I'm calling with wonderful news. Your certified wildlife habitat application has been approved. I sat down hard on the edge of the water basin, my heart pounding. Really? Already? Not only approved, but we'd like to feature your habitat in our upcoming newsletter. Dr. Rodriguez's research endorsement was incredibly compelling. And frankly, your documentation was some of the best we've ever received. We're also planning to include your garden in our online database of exemplary urban habitats. She continued with details about the certification package I'd received: the official yard sign, the certificate suitable for framing, and information about ongoing support for habitat maintenance and improvement. But what caught my attention was her final comment. Mrs. Chen, we've also been contacted by the local chapter of the Native Plant Society. They're interested in hosting a garden tour that would feature your habitat as a model for suburban conservation. Would you be open to that? A garden tour. The idea was both thrilling and terrifying. My garden had been my private sanctuary for 3 years, and now it was about to become a public example of something larger than myself. I'd be honored, I said, surprising myself with the steadiness of my voice. After hanging up, I walked through my garden with new eyes. In less than 2 weeks, this space would be officially recognized as a certified wildlife habitat. It would no longer be Karen's violation-ridden eyesore. It would be a conservation area with scientific backing and official recognition. But as I stood there, something unexpected happened. Instead of feeling vindicated or triumphant, I felt a profound sense of responsibility. This garden had become more than my personal project. It was about to become a symbol, a teaching tool, a demonstration of what was possible when humans chose to work with nature rather than against it. The certification package arrived 3 days later, and I have to admit, I felt a childlike excitement. As I opened the box, the yard sign was more beautiful than I'd expected: a rich green background with elegant gold lettering that read, Certified Wildlife Habitat, along with the National Wildlife Federation logo. The certificate was suitable for framing, as promised, with official seals and signatures that gave weight to what I'd accomplished. But the real treasure was the detailed assessment report that came with the certification. Dr. Rodriguez and her team had compiled a comprehensive analysis of my garden's ecological value, complete with species lists, habitat descriptions, and recommendations for future improvements. Reading it was like seeing my garden through the eyes of a scientist, understanding for the first time the complex web of relationships I'd unknowingly fostered. The report documented 37 different bird species that used my garden throughout the year, including several that were considered indicators of ecosystem health. It identified over 50 native plant species, many of which were supporting specialized insect populations that had become rare in urban environments. The salamander population was particularly significant, as these amphibians were extremely sensitive to environmental toxins and their presence indicated exceptionally clean soil and water conditions. Most remarkably, the report concluded that my small suburban lot was supporting a biodiversity level equivalent to much larger natural areas. The key, according to Dr. Rodriguez's analysis, was the diversity of microhabitats I'd created, from the dense shelter of the brush pile to the open meadow areas of native grass, from the vertical nesting sites in the oak tree to the ground-level water sources. I was reading the report for the 3rd time when I heard the familiar sound of heels clicking up my driveway. Karen had returned, and she was not alone. Through my front window, I could see her approaching with 2 other women I recognized from neighborhood HOA meetings, Margaret Walsh and Susan Kim, both members of the Architectural Review Committee. They were dressed in their usual suburban armor, pressed slacks, coordinated tops, and expressions of barely contained disapproval. I met them at the door, the certification report still in my hands. Mrs. Chen, Karen began, her voice carrying the weight of official business. We need to discuss your compliance with the HOA requirements. It's been 2 weeks since our initial conversation, and frankly, Your property appears to be even more overgrown than before." She gestured toward the new water feature, which I'd surrounded with native sedges and wild ginger that were already attracting their first insect visitors. "And now you've added what appears to be a pond without architectural approval." Margaret Walsh stepped forward, consulting her own clipboard. "The HOA board has authorized me to inform you that daily fines will begin accruing starting Monday if these violations aren't addressed." I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment. This was at the confrontation I'd been preparing for. But as I looked at these three women, I realized something had changed in my perspective over the past 2 weeks. I no longer saw them as enemies to be defeated. I saw them as neighbors who simply didn't understand what I was trying to accomplish. "Actually," I said, "I'd like to show you something." I handed Karen the certification report, watching her face as she read the official letterhead. Her expression shifted from confusion to surprise to something I couldn't quite identify. "This is, what exactly am I looking at?" she asked. "That's the official assessment report for my certified wildlife habitat," I said. "My garden has been recognized by the National Wildlife Federation as a model urban habitat that supports biodiversity while demonstrating sustainable gardening practices." Margaret and Susan crowded around Karen, reading over her shoulders. I watched their faces as they processed the scientific language, the official seals, the detailed documentation of what my messy garden was actually accomplishing. "There's more," I said, walking to my porch where I'd temporarily propped the yard sign. "This is the official designation sign that comes with the certification." I brought it over, letting them see the official logo, the crisp professional design, the unmistakable authority of the recognition. Karen was still reading the report, her brow furrowed in concentration. "It says here that your garden supports 37 species of birds." "That's just what they documented during their survey," I said. "I've personally observed over 40 different species since I started keeping records. And this university research project," Susan interjected, "they're studying your garden. Dr. Rodriguez is using it as a case study for her research on urban wildlife corridors," I explained. "She says small habitats like mine can serve as stepping stones that help wildlife move through developed areas." Margaret was looking from the report to my garden and back again. "But it's so natural looking. I mean, it doesn't look like a traditional garden." "That's the point," I said gently. "Traditional gardens are designed primarily for human aesthetic preferences. This garden is designed to meet the needs of wildlife while still being beautiful to humans. It's just a different kind of beauty." I gestured toward the purple coneflowers that were currently alive with the activity of native bees and butterflies. "Those flowers aren't just pretty, they're providing nectar for pollinators and will produce seeds for birds. The native grasses aren't just ornamental, they're preventing soil erosion and supporting insect populations that feed other wildlife." Karen was still staring at the report. "This says your garden has salamanders. Red-backed salamanders," I confirmed. "They're an indicator species. Their presence means the soil and water quality here are exceptionally healthy. Most suburban areas can't support them because of chemical fertilizers and pesticides." "And you don't use any chemicals?" Susan asked. "None. The garden is completely organic. The plants are native, so they don't need fertilizers or pesticides. The diversity of species creates natural pest control. Birds eat insects. Beneficial insects control harmful ones, and the salamanders help with slug and snail populations." I could see the wheels turning in their heads as they processed this information. These weren't unreasonable people. They were simply operating from a different understanding of what a garden should be. "Karen," I said, "I know this looks different from what you expected, but I'd like to propose something. The Native Plant Society wants to include my garden in their upcoming tour of urban habitats. What if we used that as an opportunity to educate the neighborhood about the benefits of native landscaping?" Karen looked up from the report, her expression unreadable. "You want to bring strangers into our neighborhood?" "I want to show our neighbors that there are alternatives to traditional landscaping that can be both beautiful and beneficial," I said. "Maybe some of them would be interested in incorporating native plants into their own gardens. Even small changes can make a difference for wildlife." Margaret was studying my garden with new eyes. "Those birdhouses, they're actually functional." "All occupied," I confirmed. "Would you like to see What followed was perhaps the most surreal hour of my life. I found myself giving Karen, Margaret, and Susa. The morning of the garden tour dawned crisp and clear, with the kind of perfect autumn light that makes everything look like it's been touched by magic. I'd been awake since 5, not from nerves exactly, but from an electric anticipation that had been building all week. What had started as a simple garden tour had evolved into something much more significant, a community event that would determine the future of sustainable landscaping in Maple Grove. The Native Plant Society had initially expected maybe 20 people for the tours. By Wednesday, the registration had grown to 55. By Friday, we were at 67 confirmed attendees, including several local journalists, 3 city council members, and a representative from the county's Environmental Services Department. But the most surprising development was Karen's transformation from reluctant observer to enthusiastic co-host. She had thrown herself into researching native plant gardening with the same intensity she'd once applied to enforcing HOA violations. Our daily phone calls over the past week had evolved from tense planning sessions to genuinely collaborative discussions about sustainable community development. "Mrs. Chen," she'd said during our call Thursday evening, "I've been reading about the environmental benefits of native landscaping, and I have to ask, why didn't you explain all this when I first came to your door?" It was a fair question, and one I'd been pondering myself. Honestly, Karen, I think I was so defensive about protecting my garden that I couldn't see past the conflict to the opportunity for education. I was so used to thinking of it as my private project that I never considered how it might inspire others. "Well," she'd replied with characteristic decisiveness, "we're certainly considering it now." As I put the finishing touches on the information stations I'd set up throughout the garden, I could hear the excited chatter of early arrivals gathering on the street. Dr. Rodriguez had arrived an hour earlier, with several of her graduate students, setting up displays that would explain the scientific aspects of urban wildlife habitats. The Native Plant Society had brought an impressive collection of educational materials, including identification guides for local species and fact sheets about the benefits of native landscaping. But the most touching addition came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Patterson, the elderly neighbor who had originally complained about the skunks to Karen, had appeared at my door that morning carrying a plate of homemade cookies and a shy smile. "I wanted to apologize," she'd said, not quite meeting my eyes. "I was afraid of the skunks because I didn't understand them." Karen explained that they're actually beneficial, and I've been watching them from my kitchen window this week. They're really quite gentle, aren't they? I'd invited her to stay for the tour, and she'd spent the morning helping me arrange informational displays, sharing stories about the birds she'd been observing in her own yard since she'd started paying attention. At exactly 10 o'clock, Karen called for everyone's attention. She stood beside my newly installed certification sign, looking every inch the professional community leader she'd always been, but with a warmth in her voice I'd never heard before. "Welcome, everyone, to what I believe will be the first of many educational tours in our neighborhood," she began. "6 weeks ago, I stood in this same spot with a very different purpose. I came here to cite violations and demand compliance with our HOA standards. Today, I'm here to celebrate innovation and to explore how our community can become a leader in sustainable suburban development." She gestured toward my garden, where the morning light was catching the seed heads of the native grasses and highlighting the deep purple of the New England asters that were blooming in spectacular abundance. "What you're about to see challenges everything we thought we knew about suburban landscaping. This garden isn't just beautiful, it's functional. It's not just aesthetically pleasing, it's ecologically vital. And it's not just one person's hobby, it's a model for how our entire community could relate to the natural world." Dr. Rodriguez took over from there, leading the group through the scientific aspects of what I'd created. But what struck me most was watching the faces of my neighbors as they began to understand what they were seeing. Tom Bradley, whose lawn was the neighborhood standard for perfectly manicured grass, stood transfixed as Dr. Rodriguez explained how the native grasses' deep root systems could prevent soil erosion and reduce the need for watering. "This actually requires less maintenance than my lawn?" he asked, incredulous. Sarah Mitchell, a young mother who'd been struggling with her toddler's allergies, was fascinated by the information about how native plants produced less allergenic pollen than many ornamental species. "And these plants don't need pesticides," she confirmed. But the moment that truly captured the transformation happening was when little Emma Rodriguez, Dr. Rodriguez's 5-year-old daughter, who had come along for the tour, suddenly pointed toward the oak tree and whispered excitedly, "Baby squirrels." The entire group turned to see a family of fox squirrels emerging from their nest in the oak's hollow, the babies tumbling playfully down the trunk while their mother watched with obvious tolerance for their antics. The sight was so charming, so unexpectedly delightful, that even the most skeptical visitors broke into smiles. In a traditional suburban landscape, Dr. Rodriguez explained quietly, so as not to disturb the squirrels, these animals would have nowhere to nest, nothing to eat, and no safe corridors to travel between habitat patches. Mrs. Chen's garden provides all of those things. As the tour continued, something remarkable began happening. The visitors weren't just observing, they were planning. I overheard conversations about converting sections of lawns to native plants, about installing rain gardens, about creating pollinator corridors between properties. Margaret Walsh, Karen's fellow HOA committee member, was deep in conversation with one of the Native Plant Society volunteers about which native shrubs would work best as foundation plantings. "I want something that will provide privacy but also support wildlife," she was saying, "and my husband will love anything that requires less watering than our current landscaping." The city council members were taking extensive notes and asking detailed questions about maintenance requirements, water usage, and potential cost savings for municipal landscaping projects. One of them, Councilwoman Jennifer Park, pulled me aside with obvious excitement. "Mrs. Chen, I have to ask, would you be willing to speak at our next council meeting? We've been looking for ways to address stormwater management and reduce municipal water usage. Your garden demonstrates solutions to both of those challenges." But the most meaningful conversation of the day happened when I found myself standing with Karen beside the water feature that had been one of her original complaints. A great blue heron had just landed at the edge of the shallow basin, and we watched in amazed silence as this magnificent bird, which I'd never seen in our neighborhood before, carefully stepped into the water and began hunting for small fish. "I had no idea," Karen said softly. "I've lived in this neighborhood for 15 years, and I've never seen anything like that." "The amazing thing is that it was probably always here," I replied. "We just didn't provide the right conditions for it to stop and rest." Karen was quiet for a moment, watching the heron's patient, graceful movements. "You know," she said finally, "I think I've been approaching community leadership all wrong. I've been so focused on maintaining standards that I forgot about creating opportunities." "You weren't wrong to want the neighborhood to be beautiful," I said. "You just had a different definition of beauty." "But your definition includes so much more," she replied. "It includes the birds and the bees and the salamanders. It includes the whole community of living things, not just the human residents." As the official tours wound down, Karen called for everyone's attention one final time. "Before you leave," she said, "I want to make an announcement. The Maple Grove Homeowners Association is forming a new committee, the Sustainable Landscaping Committee. Our goal is to revise our community guidelines to encourage native plantings and wildlife-friendly landscaping practices." She looked directly at me. "Mrs. Chen has agreed to chair this committee, and we're looking for volunteers who want to help make Maple Grove a model of suburban conservation." The response was immediate and enthusiastic. Hands shot up throughout the crowd as neighbors volunteered to participate. Tom Bradley wanted to help with water conservation initiatives. Sarah Mitchell was interested in organizing educational workshops for families. Mrs. Patterson, to everyone's surprise, offered to coordinate a neighborhood birdwatching group. But the biggest surprise came from an unexpected source. As the crowd began to disperse, a small group of children who had come with their parents lingered in the garden. Clearly reluctant to leave, they'd spent much of the tour crouched beside the water feature, watching for frogs or lying on their bellies trying to spot salamanders in the brush pile. Emma Rodriguez tugged on her mother's sleeve. "Mama, can we make our garden like this?" "One, can we help the animals too?" Dr. Rodriguez smiled. "That's exactly what we're going to do, Mia. And Mrs. Chen is going to help us figure out how." As the last visitors left, I found myself standing alone in my garden with a mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration.